So thanks so much to the organizers of this conference. It's been a really fantastic time so far, and I've learned so much from all these different interdisciplinary perspectives, so it's really been a lot of fun. And let's see. This one, forward. Aha. So my research centers around the topic of social behavior, and I think as humans, we can all really relate to this topic. People live in interconnected societies, and we're intricately dependent on our social connections, and indeed on our broader scale societal structures to function and to interact with every day, and potentially even to help us survive. But we, of course, are not alone in being so social. Sociality is something that has evolved multiple times across multiple different animal lineages and comes in a variety of different shapes and sizes, forms, and different contexts in which social behavior is observed. So why is it that sociality is such a widespread phenomenon? Well, there are a number of different benefits to living in groups. For example, being in a group can enable group members to better be able to find resources in their environment. It can allow them to avoid predators, either by having multiple group members looking out for danger, or by having rapid responses when predators do strike. And finally, being in a group can also potentially enable us to enable animals and humans to make better decisions. For example, by integrating information from multiple perspectives, like we're doing in this conference, and also by taking advantage of canceling out biases in phenomena like the wisdom of crowds. But in order to reap these benefits of group living, animal groups need to coordinate with one another. And they do that in a wide variety of different contexts. For example, many groups of animals move around together throughout their territory. And this means that they have to be constantly coming to consensus as a group on where and when they're going to move. Coordination is also required for initiating changes in group activity state. So for example, going from a group resting state to a group traveling state. And finally, coordination and cooperation are needed to join forces to face common threats. For example, mobbing of predators or defending groups against neighboring competing groups. So underlying all forms of coordination is some form of communication, be that visual, olfactory, or acoustic. And in my research, I focus primarily on vocal communication and how it underlies coordination processes. So vocal communication can be important in all three of these different contexts. Many animals have what are known as contact calls or cohesion calls that allow them to kind of ping back and forth while they're on the move to stay in touch with their group members, especially important when they can't always see each other. Vocalizations are often also involved with initiating group departures, as well as for recruiting other group members to join in collective action and for coordinating those actions once they do happen. And so my research centers on this topic, this interaction between coordination and vocal communication. And broadly speaking, we're asking the question, how do groups achieve coordination? And what role does vocal communication play in driving these coordination processes? But this is something that's actually relatively difficult to study, especially in natural social groups. And the reason is that our traditional ways of studying behavioral biology in the field, which are extremely useful for looking at social behavior in general, involve humans going out and observing animals directly. And although these methods can and have provided so many insights into diverse social structures, they're not particularly well suited to looking at these coordination processes because basically you have many individuals interacting across a wide spatial scale sometimes all at once. And so I think this challenge is nicely put in this quote from a chapter on baboon leadership, actually, by behavioral biologist Richard Byrne, when he said, "It's an observational task of daunting dimensions to attempt to record the actions of many potential decision-maker animals at once." So to tackle this daunting task, we have a lot of really exciting new tools that are helping us. And one of the really ones that I'm most excited about is called biologging. So basically, this is when you have small tags that you can deploy on animals, either attached as collars or backpacks or some other type of attachment. And these tags contain sensors that can tell you something about the behavior and movement of the animal. So often tags will contain GPS loggers, which will tell us where the animals go. They can also contain accelerometers, like you have in your phone, which can tell you, how the animal is moving and potentially what its behavior is. as well as a variety of other types of sensors like microphones, temperature loggers, pressure loggers, and so forth. And so these new tools are really opening up exciting new directions across the whole range of behavioral ecology and movement ecology, from looking at local-scale social interactions in groups to mapping broad-scale migrations across the globe. So in my work, we're using these tools to look at these coordination processes and how communication is playing a role. And we've started a interdisciplinary and international collaborative projects funded by HFSP, where we're called the Communication and Coordination Across Scales project. And in this project, we're bringing together an interdisciplinary team of field biologists and computational scientists to look at the question, how do social animals use vocal communication to coordinate group behaviors? And we're investigating this question across different species, across different spatial and temporal scales at which they're coordinating, and across different contexts. So in particular, we're focusing here on 3 different species of social mammals, and we see these species as spanning kind of a range of different levels of group cohesion, and therefore a range of different types of coordination that we see. So on the left-hand side, you have meerkats, which are form highly cohesive groups that move around together throughout the day. Basically, they have to constantly come to consensus on where to go. On the other end of the spectrum, you have spotted hyenas, which live in very dispersed groups where all group members know each other, but they're not all together at once. They form small subgroups or move around independently, and those groups split and merge over time. And then in the middle, we have coatis, which are kind of in between and do mostly stay together, but also do some splitting. And so we're using these 3 species as kind of a test bed for looking at how these species solve an overlapping but also somewhat distinct set of coordination challenges using vocal communication. Today, due to time, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the meerkats, although I will show a little bit on the coatis and hyenas at the end. So just a quick primer on meerkats. They are a social mongoose species that live in groups of anywhere from a few to up to 40 individuals. Like I mentioned before, they travel together as a group while foraging, and they forage by digging in the ground. So that means that they're often kind of not looking at each other, but rather looking at what they're doing. And because of that, they use a lot of vocalizations to coordinate movement. Because of a long-term study called the Kalahari Meerkat Project, which is run by my collaborator Marta Manzer, we actually know a huge amount about the communication system of these meerkats. We know, for example, that they have over 30 different types of vocalizations that have been characterized, and that they use them to coordinate a variety of different social behaviors, many of which are involved in these collective movement processes. So if you think about this kind of coordination challenge and bring it down to the level of the individual, that individual at any moment in time has to be deciding where it's going to move, and it might do that as a function of information that it can see about its group members and relative spatial positions, as well as the vocalizations that its group members are giving. And at the same time, that individual also has to be deciding what it's going to say, how it's going to call, what types and what rates of vocalizations. And it might do those things also based on those 2 factors. And so what we have in these groups is this complex interplay between movement decisions and communication decisions that we need to unravel to be able to understand how this coordination process is working. Because it is the combined actions of all the individuals in the group that is leading to the ability of the group to maintain cohesion and to decide where to go. And this brings us back to that observational task of daunting dimensions, because it's very difficult to monitor, to know what everybody in a group is doing at once. And so we followed the suggestion of Richard Byrne in this project, and we attempted to monitor the decisions of many potential decision makers at once. So we did this by using those biologging tools that I mentioned at the beginning. So we put small tags on these meerkats. Every individual in the group gets a tag that has a GPS device, which allows us to tell where that meerkat is every second, an audio recorder, which tells us what that meerkat is saying to its neighboring group members, and an acceleration logger, which can tell us something about its behavior. And so when we manage to deploy these collars on groups, what we get out is data that looks like this. So here, each dot represents an individual meerkat. And the little symbols that hopefully you can see coming up around the dots represent the vocalizations that those meerkats are giving. So for example, you see probably a lot of these sort of gray circles coming up around the meerkats. Those are those cohesion calls that I was mentioning in the very beginning, where the meerkats are using them to kind of ping back and forth to keep tabs on one another. We also know that these cohesion calls are attractive to the meerkats. So basically what we think is happening is that they are, and they also stimulate the production of other meerkats to make those calls. So what we think is happening is that they're sort of using positive feedback to make a kind of hotspot of calling, and that this hotspot is allowing them to coordinate movement. You may have also noticed, if you were watching carefully, that there are lots of other different types of calls. In particular, there was one individual that started giving an alarm call, and then everybody ran. So we can also look at these moments of potential danger and see how the group manages to respond to them. So there's a lot to dig into with this data. We're also developing a lot of AI tools to try and both extract the calls and to make meaning of the data and build probabilistic models at the individual and group levels. So, but of course, these social interactions are not happening in a vacuum. They are happening in a real environment, and this environment is going to affect the communication channels that are available. So one really important question for us to address when thinking about social species is, how do these coordination systems respond to environmental change? And to illustrate this, I want to give a brief example, which is in the meerkat study system. So here you can see that the Kalahari Desert is actually a widely variable habitat. These are 3 different years: a wet year, a dry year, and an extremely dry year that happened in 2016-2017, where there was a terrible drought. And so how did this massive changes in environment structure affect the coordination system? So some colleagues of mine did a study on this at the time, and what they found was that due to the kind of decrease in the amount of resources available in the environment, what happened was that the meerkats tended to spread out farther apart from each other, searching for resources. And then what happened was that they adapted their communication system to try and, basically, we're thinking to try and stay together. So they increased their call rates, those cohesion calls that are kind of the social glue pulling them together. So this was an adaptation of a system behaviorally to a change in their environment. But did this actually work to keep the group together? As it turned out, not fully, because what ended up happening was that the rate of group splits, which are normally extremely rare in meerkats, increased by a factor of 3. So we think that potentially this was reflecting of an environment-induced failure of coordination in these systems, which might actually be important for the meerkats because, again, they rely on each other, especially for things like looking out for predators. So this is just like a small example, but I think it illustrates a general point that I think is very interesting and important for us to investigate in the future, which is that environmental change, of course, can affect individuals and in species, but we should also need to think about the ways in which environmental change might affect the communicational links between individuals and the ways in which they're socializing with one another. Because potentially, when these communication links are affected, it could lead to aggregate changes in group structure, which can then have knock-on effects for survival and persistence. So moving forward, of course, the ways in which the environment is going to affect these coordination systems will depend a lot on the details of the coordination system. And so in order to understand these coordination processes, we really also need to take a cross-species approach to try and understand how different communication and coordination systems function. So we've already started doing this in our project. We are looking, as I mentioned in the beginning, at 2 other species, coatis here, shown on the left. Those are the kind of slightly less cohesive. And hyenas here, shown on the right. This is a much larger scale where they're mainly dispersed and they're kind of fissioning and fusioning with each other over time. We're really excited about these data sets. We only collected them a couple of months ago, so we're digging into them now. But I think looking forward, it would be really interesting to investigate these topics across a wider range of species in order to start asking more general questions about, are there some general principles that we can think of that apply to coordination and communication systems across different species? And on the flip side, in what ways are these systems affected by their social and ecological constraints? And thinking also about the effects of environmental change, can we predict how flexible and robust these systems are going to be? Can we predict when these systems will be able to adapt to environmental change or when they might break down or change group structures? So with that, I would like to thank all of my collaborators on the Communication and Coordination Across Scales project, as well as my research group back in Konstanz, and thank you all for your attention.